Did Christianity play a unique role in the development of modern science, or is Christianity somehow uniquely responsible for the development of science, beginning during the period that historians would identify as the scientific revolution? Does Christianity have a special place in that history? And by special place here, I mean, is Christianity more of an influenced kind of over and against other religious traditions or other religious institutions? Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is going to be the second part of my video series, I guess, if you want to call it that, on a video that was released by Dr. David Wood concerning the relationship between atheism and Christianity. Again, the purpose of these videos is not to defend atheism against Dr. Wood's claims. Rather, it's to evaluate some of the historical claims that are made by Dr. Wood. And the reason why I'm focusing in on these claims, I kind of mentioned this in the video that I made about slavery, because these claims, I often hear these historical instances and examples that Dr. Wood is going to use, slavery and the history of science, are two examples that I oftentimes hear brought up in apologetics and in apologetics answers and responses to certain things. And so here, what Dr. Wood is doing is responding to the claim that he perceives as made by atheists that Christianity is somehow against or working against the development of science. And instead, he's going to claim that Christianity is uniquely responsible for the rise and the development of modern science. Now, I have made several videos on my channel discussing the relationship between Christianity and modern science. This is going to be another example of one of those videos. I want to reiterate here at the start of this video that I am not supporting or proposing a version of what's known as the conflict thesis. See, I'll link some of my other videos where I outline what the conflict thesis is. But in a nutshell, the conflict thesis is the idea that religion, and Christianity specifically, has somehow hindered or delayed the development of science, that the church actively opposed science and has been working against scientific institutions since their conception. That is a view and a position that was popular, especially in the early 20th century, but which has largely been rejected by historians of science. That's not what I'm talking about today. What I'm going to be addressing today is you can kind of think of as the opposite of the conflict thesis. And this is oftentimes found throughout Christian apologetics. And this is the claim that Christianity and Christianity alone, or maybe not Christianity alone, but Christianity uniquely or specifically had something to do with the development of modern science over and against other religious institutions or traditions, and that therefore Christianity has some sort of special epistemological claim to science. Again, evaluating or elevating the status of Christianity over and against other traditions to give Christianity more epistemological, philosophical, scientific weight over and against other religious traditions. So that's what we're going to be evaluating today. And it's going to be a response, of course, to some claims that David Wood makes in his video. So I'm going to go ahead and play that and we'll get into the response.
What's the problem with the claims of our atheist friends? Well, in the past, there were many scientific developments over many centuries, and these developments happened around the world. But the scientific revolution occurred in a certain place at a certain time. And the people who were responsible for the scientific revolution were all Christians of one sort or another, Catholics, Protestants, an occasional heretic, but they all believed in God and the Bible. The pioneers of the scientific revolution, again, all of whom were some variety of Christian, through their discoveries in astronomy and physics and chemistry and biology, gave rise to modern science.
So there's this prevailing narrative, especially amongst the apologetic community, that the development of modern science is somehow uniquely influenced by Christianity, or that Christianity played a special part in its development. And Dr. Wood here in this video makes this argument explicitly. Dr. Wood's going to reference a video that I've recently reviewed, a conversation between Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins, in which Jordan Peterson argues to Dawkins that modern science is predicated kind of on Christian or theistic assumptions. I'm not really going to review any of that conversation since I've already reviewed it in a previous video of mine. What I do want to point out here is that in making this argument, apologists like Dr. Wood are in a way putting too much emphasis on the concept, on the notion of a scientific revolution, a category that I would argue is a form of meta narrative. It's a category that historians use largely for convenience in order to refer to a specific time period, but which is a category that, as we'll see, was developed much later, historiographically speaking. It was developed in like the 50s and the 60s as a reference to the developments that happened in the 15th and 16th century. But by emphasizing the term in this way, and by saying that modern science developed in Europe, or that the scientific revolution specifically happened in Europe, you're basically creating an event, positing a category that, historically speaking, wasn't really there. That sounds weird. I have a different video on meta narratives if you're interested in that. But the reason why I'm bringing this up, despite it sounding weird, is that this sort of argument that's being constructed here, predicated on this notion of a scientific revolution, is inherently faulty and problematic, because the problem with any sort of meta narrative or meta explanation is that by positing it, you are oversimplifying the historical context and the events that actually happen in order to justify some sort of pre-existing narrative. And in this case, what Dr. Wood is doing is simplifying the history in order to justify the claim that Christianity itself is uniquely responsible. To explain what I mean, I want to read you a quote from James Secord in his article, Inventing the Scientific Revolution. Here, Secord explains the scientific revolution, despite upheavals within the discipline, remains the episode through which the history of science holds a place in public life. These three words are widely taken to signal a 17th century breakthrough that led reason to triumph over traditional knowledge and religion. However, as Secord explains throughout his article, this is largely a myth, so to speak. This is largely an idea that was developed in the 1950s in order to retroactively explain this time period. They are seen as marking a turning point in the making of the modern world. Justification for the global, and this narrative, this myth, is taken as justification for the global dominance of the West and a central pillar of the ideology of progress through science. So Dr. Secord goes on to note that the scientific revolution as a concept has been intensely scrutinized over the past 30 years. It's really been within the past 30 years that we've started to break down what exactly happened during this time period and whether or not it makes sense to talk about this time period as the scientific revolution as a whole. What has emerged as a result of all of this scholarship challenges the very idea of a scientific revolution as a specific period in time, as condensed to a specific, as regulated to a certain period, and as regulated to a geographic region. As we'll see, what is being challenged here is not so much that something happened during this. Nobody's debating whether or not Copernicus, Galileo, or Newton existed, but what's happening here is that the discoveries, the inventions, the writing of all of these people are starting to be contextualized more and more within a global context rather than within purely or strictly a European context that's limited to a single place in history and to a single geographical point. What's happening is an opening up or expanding of this concept of the scientific revolution, and to push back, as we'll see, to push back against this interpretation that Dr. Wood is presenting, that this event happened only in Europe and only starting in the 15th or 16th century. As Secord goes on to explain this, the scientific revolution was a creation of the progressive era. The route to it was not through scholarly debates in the history of science, a discipline that did not exist, This is in the 1950s, but through a strand of historical writing about the origins of modernity, grounded in evolutionary psychology, anthropology, and the American philosophy of pragmatism. Philosophers like John Dewey, especially, are to thank for the development of this notion of a radical break with the scientific revolution, that something radically new happened. So, in short, I bring this up to say that the very notion of the scientific revolution is a concept or a category that was developed beginning in the 1950s by these historians. And this is largely a result of two historians in particular. The first is a French historian named Alexander Corre. Corre is known for the book that he published. I recently purchased a new copy. I had an older copy that was falling apart. But Corre published the book From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe that I would highly suggest. It's a bit dated now, but some of the ideas that Corre expresses are incredibly influential, especially for people like me who are interested in the French historical epistemology tradition of the early 20th century. The philosopher that I studied, Gaston Bachelard, is deeply influenced by Corre. In his book, Corre is going to focus more on the intellectual and the philosophical transformation that kind of underpinned what we identify as the scientific revolution. Unlike Butterfield, Corre did not view the scientific revolution as purely a revolution of empiricism or a dominance of empiricism as an empirical shift, but rather as a conceptual and metaphysical transformation. One of the things that Corre is really going to emphasize are the mathematical developments of the scientific revolution and the status of mathematics in order to explain imperial phenomenon is something that really stands out about Corre's book, and something that also really influenced Bachelard, if you are familiar with Bachelard's epistemological writing. Corre will emphasize the role of Platonism and the shift away from Aristotelian science, especially in the cosmologies of Copernicus and Galileo, to a more mathematical or mechanical universe. So Corre is one of the traditions that really emerges in the 50s in our understanding of the scientific revolution. The other historian slash philosopher that's going to emerge is Herbert Butterfield. In his Origins of Modern Science, Butterfield argues that the scientific revolution was a dramatic, transformative event on par with the adoption of Christianity into the Roman Empire that marked a fundamental shift in human thought. Butterfield notes that this is predominantly a methodological shift of science moving away from Aristotelian logic and medieval scholasticism and really embracing a form of concrete empiricism that Butterfield said would come to dominate, especially like 16th and 17th century science. Butterfield writing in English, Corre writing in French, won't be translated until like the 60s and 70s, I believe, is when the first translation comes out. But because Butterfield's writing in English, it's really the Butterfieldian tradition, for lack of a better word, that's going to most influence English scholarship within the history of science. And it's really this idea that Butterfield presented of a radical break and transformation from the past, and this emphasis on empiricism that's really going to come to dominate, especially popular level thought with respect to the scientific revolution. And apologists specifically, I noticed, tend to lead heavy on this idea that the scientific revolution represents something that's distinctively new, that modern science represents a radical departure from the past. In Butterfield comes this emphasis on experimentation. Apologists, however, want to emphasize the newness of modern science is somehow dependent upon Christian, especially like Christian presuppositions. They'll argue that science, modern science, is dependent upon this idea that nature is intelligible, or that the laws of nature are something that are discoverable. I want to be really clear in this video. So Dr. Wood's going to appeal to Dr. Jordan Peterson in kind of as a sort of a justification for his position. But to be clear, Jordan Peterson is not a historian. He's not a philosopher. He's a clinical psychologist by training. Dr. Wood in no way, shape, or form is going to appeal to any of the secondary literature, especially the secondary literature that deals explicitly with the history of science. And I'm not even sure that Dr. Wood is aware of this tradition. I'm kind of attributing him being influenced by Butterfield. I'm not sure if he's ever read Butterfield's book or is even aware that there is this distinction between Corey and Butterfield and how they approach the scientific revolution or modern developments in the history of science. I don't think any of that is happening at the popular apologetic level, but this idea that science owes some sort of special presuppositions to Christianity, or that science is uniquely benefiting from these explicitly Christian ideas, is not really found anywhere in the scholarly secondary literature. You're going to be hard pressed to find a historian of science that is really going to agree with the sort of claims that Dr. Wood or Dr. Peterson are making about the relationship between Christianity and science. And that is very problematic on an academic level in terms of supporting your argument, in terms of supporting the case. The fact that no historian of science mentions this in the popular level history of science books, and especially in the academic level articles concerning the history of science, is a humongous red flag. The apologist claims tends to hinge solely on the fact of their understanding of quote unquote modern science. It's modern science as opposed to ancient science, or I've heard people like Michael Jones call it proto-science. Most of their claims hinges on this distinction between the two, that modern science is somehow unique in the kind of the Butterfield tradition, that it's unique and distinct from its ancient predecessors, and that it's modern science that owes its origins and beginnings to Christianity. And that's why modern science appears in Europe and not in other places. But what we've seen more recently, especially within the context of historical scholarship, is that the very idea of the scientific revolution as a distinct category has been challenged. What has emerged in its place, in place of the Butterfieldian of Butterfield's interpretation, is a more contextual picture that provides more context and understanding of what exactly was happening in the 16th and the 17th centuries, putting it more, as we'll see, in more of a global context. I say contextual here because what has started to happen is that historians have begun to put the central figures of the scientific revolution, people like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, in conversation and within the context of larger historical developments that were happening at the time. This includes everything from the influx of astronomical writing that's coming from the Muslim world in the 15th and the 16th century, to beginnings and the practices of European colonialism, ushering in what is sometimes called the Age of Discovery, the discovery of the Americas and the new cultures and civilizations, as well as the scientific knowledge that they're getting from the Americas. In short, what has been emerging more recently is a more global, worldwide context for the development of the history of science, of modern science especially. So yes, the scientific revolution did begin in Europe. However, this beginning is deeply influenced and shaped by other distinctively non-European traditions and non-European histories. Yes, Christianity is a part of the cultural ethos that shape the development of modern science, is a part of the culture that shaped the development of modern science. But that at the same time, however, so is Islam, Confucianism, Hinduism, and various other indigenous traditions help to shape the development of modern science as well. And I think to ignore these traditions and to ignore these histories is to indirectly argue that science somehow appeared in a historical vacuum. And there's not a single event in history that has occurred in a vacuum. And the scientific revolution, even if we want to use that term and that terminology, is no different. And on that note, I want to leave you with a quote from a historian whose book I've recently been reading. This is Dr. James Poskett from his book Horizons: The Global Origins of Modern Science. And this is what Dr. Poskett has to say. Science was not the product of a unique European culture. Rather, modern science has always depended upon bringing people together and ideas from different cultures around the world. Copernicus is a good example of this. He was writing at the time when Europe was forging new connections with Asia, and with caravans traveling along the Silk Road, as well as galleons sailing across the Indian Ocean. In his scientific work, Copernicus relied upon mathematical techniques borrowed from the Arabic and Persian text, many of which had only recently begun to be imported into Europe. Similar kinds of scientific exchange were taking place throughout Asia and Africa. This was the same, in which the Ottoman astronomers journeyed across the Mediterranean, combining their knowledge of Islamic science with the new ideas borrowed from Christian and Jewish thinkers. In West Africa, at the courts of Timbuktu and Kano, mathematicians studied Arabic manuscripts imported from across the Sahara. To the east, astronomers in Beijing read Chinese classics alongside Latin scientific text and compiled some of the most accurate astronomical tables ever made. All of this suggests a very different way of understanding the history of modern science. We need to think of the history of modern science in terms of key moments in global history. All right, so that is all I got for this video. Let me know what you think about my argument. Let me know what you think about Dr. Wood's argument. I would be especially curious for those of you who support Dr. Wood's argument to let me know what secondary literature exists in order to support these points. I'm always more than happy to read the history of science. It's like one of my favorite things to read. So please, by all means, post your sources below, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you.